Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Angela Brennan and today I'm bringing you the Spellbinders Stitching Die of the Month, September 2024, Stitched Sunflower. I had so much fun doing various flowers with this die. You put the die together and get the stitched element of the flower as well, or you can just die cut the outline and just get the outline of it. So if you're not feeling like stitching, you can just put the outline, or you can die cut the outline in a different color and put it behind the stitched holes. And then this is the center of the flower, which you can either cut in colored card, die cut in colored card, or white card. And the stem, just one stem, you can do it multiple stems if you want. And then it comes with a sentiment. Thanks so much. You've got the thin die of the sentiment, and you've also got the shadow die. So you can use it with or without the shadow. Thanks so much. Here I've got it with the shadow or black shadow and the white words. The white die cut of the sentiment, I've doubled it up so that there's some layering on it, and it's just as a bit of dimension on the shadow. So as usual, I will smudge the ink excess glue off on the die cut because it's so thin before I put it onto the shadow of the sentiment. This is a clear drying liquid glue, so it doesn't really matter if it's not all smudged off properly, but I just like it to be tidy. So thanks so much is great to have as a sentiment because I don't make many thank you cards. When I need it, I always end up having to change the sentiment on a card. So thanks so much. This is this autumn, is a season of Thanksgiving, so there's lots of thanks in the sentiment for the Spellbinders Clubkits for this month. Once I've die cut the flowers, I put it onto the stamp wheel, which is just the sticky mat is what I'm using. So I use the stamp wheel because that's the sticky mat that I have. But there are many sticky mats in the market that you could use. The aim is to place the die cut on the sticky mat while I'm adding some ink onto it. And I tend to use distress inks when I'm coloring die cuts. And then I use distress oxide inks for the backgrounds. It's just what I usually do. I just use some ink onto the colored card, and now for this white center I'm just going to put some brown for the outline and green or a dark yellow for the center. So I alternate. I start off with a lighter green and I wanted the center to be lighter, and I'm putting some darker green, which is peel paint, on the side. I do add a bit of rustic wilderness, which is a really dark green, at the edges once it dries, because some of these inks when they dry, they do dry lighter. And I double up the petals because I wanted it to be more a fuller sunflower. So I double it up. I did look up the colors of sunflowers. They're not just all yellow. You get variations from yellow to red. So I do quite a few colors in between. So I do use lots of yellows, various shades of orange and red. So here I'm trying to do something slightly multicolored, which I'm using the yellows, the oranges, as well as the reds from the Distress Ink range. I want the darker shades to be closer to the center of the flower, with the ends of the petals having the lighter colors. That's what I'm trying to achieve in this ink blending here. I do have quite a few distress inks, and the reason I use them so often is because I've got quite a few of them, as well as got a great storage system for my distress inks, as well as the foam pads that I have for each of the distress ink colors. And I'll link the video that I have on the storage system of my distress inks, as well as the color combinations that I use, in the description below, so you can have a look at it. So I like this yellowish orangey red color, and I do two of it because I want to double up all my flowers. I think if it's on its own, it looks a little bit less of a full, not quite a sunflower. You could use it on its own, but I just wanted to double up. I like the look of it. And this is the die cut that I'm not going to do any stitching on it. But this one here, I'm just putting some additional red on the flower that's going to be die cut flower that's going to be behind, because I want a bit more of a shadow. So the red hue will peek out behind the flower in the center. I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And when you do subscribe, remember to press that notification bell so you're alerted when new videos are uploaded. I do lots of Spellbinders Club Kits, and I'm quite excited to see I've been invited to do the same for next year as well, and I'm going to do all 10 Club Kits. So I will release a playlist every month of the Spellbinders Club Kits, so it's easier for you to access the videos of each month. And each month when the Spellbinders releases their club kits, they do it on a theme, which is why I tend to store my Spellbinders club kits by month, unless they are sentiment heavy, like last month's as a small die of the month, which was very, very sentiment heavy. I do keep that separately closer to where I'm crafting. So I hope you check those playlists out when you get your club kits. Here, because I die cut the flower in colored card, which is slightly thin, I've put another layer of white, thicker white card behind it because it makes it easier for me to do my stitching later on. If I want to die cut a thick card, it's going to be hard to die cut all those tiny stitching holes. So that's why I tend to die cut using your usual colored cards thickness, and then I cut a thicker die cut of white with white card, put it behind it, so it's got a little bit more substance, a little bit more robust when I'm doing my stitching. Here I'm using the Diamant metallic gold thread from DMC to do my stitching. I do like using metallic thread when I do my stitching. It's a little bit harder to manage because you need to keep it taut for every stitch. So if you're a beginner, do not use metallic threads, use cotton threads, and I'll show you how I use a cotton thread later on as well. But I tend to use metallic threads when I do my stitching. I always use at least one stitching with metallic threads because I do like it. It's a little bit unwieldy, this one here, because of all the petals. When you have a longer thread, it might get stuck between all the petals, so you just need to be a little bit patient when you're doing the stitching here. I secure the back of the thread with cellophane tape, but also between the petals because I don't want to have to start all over again. I just bend the thread a little bit between the petals and just put cellophane tape behind so it sticks behind each of the petals before I can move on to the next petal. It's pretty easy to do, and you just use your sticky tape and get that done, so you have the continuous thread to do all of the petals. It takes a little bit time, this stitching, but I enjoy doing it, and I tend to do it when I'm listening to an audiobook or watching some television. That's when I do my stitching of all my stitching dies. And here I'm doing stitching for both petals that I'm going to layer. You don't have to stitch both petals because the second layer will be covered quite a bit, but you can see it through. So I'm just going to stitch all of it and see how it goes. And then when I start layering my flowers, I like to see a full sunflower. I like to see the fullness of it. Now the center of the petal, there's a couple of ways you can stitch it. For this first one here, I'm using metallic thread, and I'm just going to follow through and stitch the circular, so the holes that's around the die cut, the circular die cut, I'm just going to stitch around it so you get the gold thread in a circle for this flower center. And later on I show how I do some zigzag as well, so you can see the edge lines, and I think it caters for both. You can do circular and do it in a zigzag pattern or across the circle, or you can do both in one circle as well. It's really up to you how much stitching you want to do. Or you don't have to do any stitching at all. So, though it's called a stitching die, it's really up to you how much stitching you want to do for each component or each of the die cuts. Even the leaves, you don't have to stitch it, but I do stitch quite a few of it, most of it actually, and some of it I don't stitch. I was not sure of a green center, but I do like how this turned out. For this flower, I'm using cotton thread, 3 strands of cotton thread to do my stitching, and you can see in the back of the flower here how I've stuck the petals or the thread between the petals to do a continuous stitching. So I can use either DMC cotton thread or LUCA-S cotton thread. I tend to use LUCA-S cotton thread because it's less dear and it has the same durability and shine that you can get from other cotton thread. So I continue stitching and I secure the back again with some sticky tape or cellophane tape, just so the end of the thread is secured. I liked how this die cut turned out with the multicolored flower and the red thread. Here I'm going to show you how I do the center of the flower. When I use 6-strand cotton thread, I remove the strands one by one. I tend to use only 3 strands when I do my stitching for these kind of die cuts. I remove the strands one by one to avoid any of knotting and wastage of the thread, and then I pull them together, use a threader to put the thread through the needle, and I use size 24 DMC tapestry needle for all my stitching here. Secure the back of the thread with some sticky tape, and then I proceed to do stitching. Now I do it vertically and then I do it the other way. So this kind of crisscross stitching is another way to do the center of the flower. So if you see, once I've done this vertical stitching, when I come through the other way, I don't just stitch it from one end to the other. I tend to weave the thread between all the vertical lines, so the thread doesn't just stick out. I think it looks better that way. Here I'm using more of a tone on tone. You see the color of the thread is very similar to the circle that I've die cut for the flower center. You can use a contrasting color as well, and I do both. If I use gold metallic thread, it will stand out a bit more. But here I'm using a tone on tone color and weaving the thread through. This way the thread that will not pull easily when you put it on the front of the card. So I just like the way this turns out. And to further decorate the centers, I tend to put quite a lot of tiny gems once I've completed the card. And I really like the feel of it once I've completed the card with the tiny gems in the center of the flower. It just makes the center of the flower look a little bit more special. And notice that all the ink blending on the die cut does come through despite all the stitching. I do like how that's turned out. So remember to do all of your ink blending before you start doing any stitching, if you intend to do stitching. So, and then you just secure the back of the thread with some sticky tape again, and it'll keep it secure and allow you to put it in the front of the card or assemble your flower. So you can use the front either green or orange, or you can use any color really, it's totally up to you. Here I'm stitching the leaves pretty straightforward. Just follow the etched lines or don't do any stitching, because if you don't do any stitching, even though you have die cut it and ink blended this way, you can just die cut the outline of the leaf and let the color of that card come through. So say supposing you die cut the outline of the leaf with some metallic gold or metallic silver, it will come through those stitching holes that you have there if you decide not to do any stitching. Totally flexible, this stitching die. Just because the name is stitching doesn't mean you have to do stitching all the time. So you can just be flexible and just use it as any other die cut and do lots of ink blending. I do love ink blending my die cuts. Die cut everything in white card and do some ink blending. But here I did a mixture. I did do some die cutting in colored card and did some ink blending as well. So if this is quite a tiny die cut to stitch, so if you want it to be sturdier, you do put a white card behind it, so it is thicker and as more robust when you do your stitching. Now I'm going to get some backgrounds done. Per usual, I like to use Distress Oxide inks to do my background, but here I'm just going to do a little bit. I'm just going to do some broken china and tumbled glass, and just in the corner, one part of this Strathmore Bristol smooth card before I do some embossing. I used the embossing folder of the month for September 2024 called the Autumn Chevron to do some embossing here. Now before I do any embossing, per usual, I spritz some water in the back of the ink blended card, so I soften the fibers, and that will prevent any cracking when I put it through the embossing machine. Now using this is a 2D embossing folder, so you use the right sandwich to do it, and I tend to put a heavy object on it to let it dry flat while the dampness goes away so it doesn't warp. Now I'm going to put this on the front of an A6 card. An A6 card is a common card size in the UK, and it measures 14.8 centimeters by 10.5 centimeters. So the embossed card, I always tend to do it slightly bigger, so I can just stick it onto the card front and just cut off the excess. That way I know the card front will be flush with the embossed panel. I back the embossed panel with some foam sheet to keep the card straight, but also to give it some dimension. I tend to do this most of the time, so especially when I have an embossed panel. But before I put it in the card front, I'm going to do some splattering of metallic gold watercolor onto the card front. I just think it gives it a little bit of extra on the background. I think the gold and the blue against the orangey red flower is going to come out so beautifully. Simple colors, simple composition, but because of the richness of that background and that beautiful sunflower, the card is just beautiful. I like the way it turned out, though it's the simplicity of the card tells you that you don't need much. One perfect embellishment in the front in the form of that flower, and you just put that sentiment. I secure all of the die cuts to the flower with some liquid glue, and I also use some dimensional tape for the back of the die cut flowers just to give it a little bit of a pop on the card front. I think it's easier to secure it with some dimensional tape to give that pop, but also it works better when you've got an embossed panel that you're sticking your die cuts to. So I'm just assembling the card here. I've either got dimensional tape or sticky tape on the back of all these die cuts. So once I've got it all ready, I just need to just stick it on. For the thanks so much sentiment, I've just done that as I showed in the beginning with a black shadow die and a white sentiment die, which I've doubled up for some dimension. I do love how this card turned out with its bold colors. Now I'm going to make that center of the flower a little bit more special by using my liquid glue and sticking some very tiny gems on the crisscross pattern of that flower center. You can't really see it, but when it's completed, I think it looks really, really gorgeous. And having this crystal katana media picker tool handy, it's so good for these tiny gems as well as for tiny die cuts. Really, really handy tool to have around. And this card is completed. Now I'm going to be doing assembly of flowers and also putting cards together here. What I'm doing here is trying to give some dimension to the card. So I'm loosening the fibers of the flower. Despite it being stitched, it's still very secure and it's not going to mess up with the stitches. I'm just turning the petals up slightly to give this flower, before I layer it up, some dimension so it just doesn't lie flat. You can have it lying flat as well. So it depends whether you're going to send it through the mail or not. So some of these cards, I think for me, it's too thick to send through the mail. Probably one of those I don't put through the mail, at least not overseas mail anyway. So I'm just securing this with some double-sided tape, doing some fluffing or bending the paper a little bit or the card a little bit to give it a little bit more dimension. And you can use any tool that is around you, and failing all, just use your fingers. Attaching some dimensional tape behind the flower center, and then you've got quite a few flowers that I have assembled and ready to use on a card front. Here I'm doing the same thing really, turning the flowers out for both levels of the petal. And if you see here, you've got the flower and the petal, not much of a contrast there, so quite similar in colors. So I've tried to show various combinations. You can have a contrasting flower center or have something that's more aligned to the flower petals. It's fine, and I've put gems on almost every single flower petal and gone a little bit nuts with the gems. I do love tiny gems. I think they look so delicate and elegant. This flower die cut here, it's no stitching done on it, so it's single layer. I didn't put an additional layer behind because I didn't need it to be too robust, and that's why it allows me to manipulate the petals a little bit more, and therefore the petals will give it more dimension. Here I'm doing some background again with my Strathmore Bristol smooth card and 3 different colors of Distress Oxide inks to do a background. I'm going to put a full background of colors here, and as usual for ink blending, successful ink blending anyway, you need 3 key ingredients: the right card, and I'm using the Strathmore Bristol smooth card, which to me is the perfect card to do ink blending. Then you use your foam pads, your domed foam pads, which is what I'm using, and I have one for each color. Do check out my storage system for this because I think it makes it a lot easier. And finally, you need to have juicy ink pads. So almost all of my Distress inks and Distress Oxide inks, I tend to have my refills as well, my ink refills, because if not, it's horrible trying to do any ink blending with a dry ink pad. You will not achieve the ink blending that you want. I really like this background. I'm going to put quite a strong colored flower in the front of it so the color pops. I sprayed the back of the ink blended card with water to soften the fibers of the card and put it through the embossing folder for a 2D embossing folder sandwich. I'm wiping off the excess ink that's gone onto the inside of the embossing folder in case I forget and use it again and spoil a card that I'm going to emboss. I love this color combination, and I'm going to attach it to the card front with some double-sided tape. But before that, I'm going to sprinkle it with some water because it reacts so well with water. Distress Oxide inks reacts really well with water, and you see a lovely splatter there of some light colors. I'm attaching the inked and embossed panel onto an A6 card front with just some double-sided tape. I'm not putting the additional layer or foam sheet here because it dried pretty straight and I want to reduce the thickness or the bulk of the card. Just going to cut off the excess that is sticking outside the card base. Easy enough to do. So the card embossed panel is nice and flush on the card front. Attaching that vibrant yellow sunflower with that green center to the card front. I think it's very contrasting and it does pop. You can do it with a white background as well. Maybe I didn't need such a heavy background, but I really like the pinks and purples against that big yellow sunflower. Do leave me some feedback as to which cards you think are lovely and which cards you think maybe it's overdone. I'd really like to get some feedback. Good or bad, I don't mind, because sometimes I think, oh, that card's really nice and I'm really all into that card and I get not so great feedback on it. And sometimes when I think that's not so great and I get great feedback. So it really, beauty is truly in the eyes of the beholder and everyone's got a slightly different taste. So really keen to get some feedback on these various color combinations and card compilations as well. So I've assembled most of these cards with an embossed background because I do really like the 2D embossing folder of the month this month, and I tend to use it quite a bit in putting these cards together. And here you have a completed card. For the next card, I'm going to get a sentiment from the clear stamp of the month, and the clear stamp of the month, the sentiment is "You are such a blessing." The clear stamp of the month from this month, which is September 2024, the theme goes again with lots of Thanksgiving, thank you kind of sentiments. So I'm just stamping it with some VersaFine ink using my MISTI, and then because the color is not as dark, I ink and stamp it a few times until I get it the shade that I want it. I don't have an ink refill for this stamp pad, so I've had to resort to stamping it a few times to get a darker color. I like to have a little bit of dimension onto my stamping. So I'm stamping it also with some clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to sprinkle some clear embossing powder onto it and melt that embossing powder with my heat tool. I like to do that firstly because the ink won't smudge, because these VersaFine inks are pigment ink, so I don't wait for it to dry. But also I like it having a little bit of dimension and shine before I die cut it. So the clear stamp of the month for this sentiment, it comes with a coordinating die. So I do die cut it with the coordinating die. When I do die cut it, I die cut a few layers because I like to layer up my sentiment so that it gives a little bit of dimension when I put it onto the card front. I've already embossed this card panel, and there you go, I've got the card completed. Simple and beautiful. The next card here, I've got 2 layers here. This is a 5 by 7 card, so 5 inches by 7 inches, and I've cut a slightly smaller panel which is 4 inches by 6 inches, and I'm going to put it into my MISTI, my stamping platform. And this little bit of a stamp here is from the clear stamp of the month, Autumn Wishes, from September 2024. Before I do any stamping, I'm going to use my stamp conditioning eraser to remove that sheen on top of that new stamp so that it can let the ink sit on it for stamping. And I'm using a brown ink from Altenew to stamp both layers together. Press it with a stamp press tool. I'm doing a couple of layers because I want a slightly darker shade because it's quite a light brown. And then I remove that 4 by 6 layer and make sure I stamp the image onto the card base again, because I want it to be full, and when I layer it together, the image will be seamless, and this is what I want to achieve. But I'm going to attach that 4 by 6 layer, the smaller layer, onto the card base with some dimension. So I'm going to put a foam sheet behind it and then put it onto the card front before I put some sunflowers on it. I'm going to do 2 sunflowers on this because it's quite a large card base, and I'm going to let that overlap onto the side as well. You got these 2 similar colored sunflowers, and I'm going to let the flower go over that inner layer of 4 by 6 so it overlaps, and I think it just looks pretty. And I do like that little stamp in the corner. It goes with the theme of autumn and Thanksgiving as well. So easy enough to put together. I wanted a slightly different card composition. Do you know, these flowers are nice and big. You can do a few and put it onto a scrapbook page as well, especially if you've got a nice autumn or Thanksgiving gathering or family members that are coming for a meal, I think it'll be nice to dot this around the scrapbook page and put that beautiful picture in the middle. This is sentiment hello to you and yours is from the clear stamp of the month as well. I stamped it with some VersaFine Clear pine cone ink and then also did some clear embossing powder onto it, so it gives it some dimension. I think it's really pretty how this card turned out. Here are all the cards that I've created. I really hope you've enjoyed the video and you find the ideas interesting. Do let me know what you think in the comments below. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And when you do subscribe, remember to press that notification bell so you're alerted when more new videos are uploaded. Do remember that once I finish all my videos for this club kit of the month, I will put a playlist of all the videos that I create cards with this month's club kit, so it's easy for you to get to those videos. All of the products I've used, or everything that I can remember, I have listed it in the description below to the best of my abilities. If something is missing, just leave me a comment and I'll get back to you. Here are the different pictures of the cards that I've created. You can see some close-up pictures as well. So have an idea of what you want to do, get some inspiration, so when you get your club kits, you can go to town with it. All Spellbinders club kits you can order between the 6th and 27th of each month. Do enjoy crafting and I'll catch you in my next video. Take care.